Hey Stephen, how's it going?
Hey Benji, doing well. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Just looking over the list of things that I would like to get into our July release of the spec and saying, gonna need more days.
Yeah, there's a bunch of little things that have been moving along incrementally over the like last 5 years and like that close.
Just wanna push them over the edge, like the cat just bopping it, bop it over the
Yeah,
edge.
it feels like 2025 should be the year, like 10-year anniversary of GraphQL. Like should get some of these things in.
Yeah, it does make me wonder whether maybe we should push it back a month or two for the spec cut just to try and get a few extra things in.
Maybe yeah. I like the one agenda item I put on today is one that like I think it's about ready to merge, but it was RFC one. So I'm like, okay, well, let's just go ahead and just like get it RFC two, still do like one step at a time, but at least like bump it along.
Also schema coordinates, like we should get those in because like I want to use them like in the spec text.
Hmm.
It would be really helpful to be able to refer to parts of the schema using schema coordinates in the spec text.
Oh, I see. Like being able to use them. Oh, interesting. Like with examples and
So
stuff,
I'm
or
thinking about saying things like, rather than saying you can use the description field on the double underscore field type to read the description, you could just say you can use the field dot description.
mm.
Dunderfield dot
I
description,
mean, we could
whatever.
probably just start using spec text even without it being like official. I mean, like GraphQL, like SDL started as just being used in the spec text, right?
Yeah,
You
spec
know,
on it.
and then kind of became a specified thing.
Opened in November 2020.
Which one? Schema coordinates?
Yeah, approved by me 5 days later.
Nice.
Let's go. Lee approved these changes on April 14th, 2021. Why aren't they merged? Why aren't they merged? All right, I'm going to bump that. I'm going to pull that PR down and bring it up to date.
Hey, friends.
Hey, Lee.
Hello.
Is it just the three of us here today? I see in our attendee list that we're short.
I believe so.
That's totally fine. That's often how these secondary ones go. Um, which means how many minutes should I spend on the introduction? We all agreed to the membership agreement, participation, contribution. All right. Um, let's just dig into our agenda. Um, Stephen, you've got one for us to talk about on executable definitions. Benji, you've got one on error propagation. And then anything else that pops up, we'll dig into.
Yeah, so agenda wise, there's just a whole load of stuff follow up from last month. I haven't added them individually last month, 2 weeks ago. I
Yeah,
haven't added them individually, but yeah, if we can use some time to work through those, that would be great.
I figured that would be the case. We could just spend kind of the first half of the meeting, go through what's on our agenda, and then the second half, just kind of hammering through everything we can think of that's worth doing live.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right, Steven, you're up. You got the
All
first one
right.
for us.
So this is an RFC that it just came up recently. It was something I was working on, and I was like, oh, this should be a thing. Started writing an RFC, and then I was like, wait. probably I'm not the first. And sure enough, there's an RFC from several years ago from Yvonne about the exact thing that I was wanting. And there's already a GraphQL JS PR. And so basically the agenda for today, I was wondering about just moving to RFC2 for now. Um, or further. Um, but yeah, I guess first thing is consensus on the solution or any dissent.
I think that descriptions on executable documents or definitions would be valuable, honestly. It's particularly valuable when you're doing things like writing queries and documentation or example queries, like especially if you're using something like trusted documents, you can only allow these ones, but you want to include in them a description. You can just put comments in, and that is okay. But by by doing it with the description, you can actually extract them from the parsing.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the workaround was just to add comments, but that's exactly what descriptions are for. And the use case I was running into specifically was uh, a simple tool that uses GraphQL operations to define MCP tools. MCP tools need a good description, and so
Mm.
voila.
And often they would a lot of the common tricks for MCP is to do comment parsing, which is underwhelming. Um, cool. I like this. I'm trying to remember why this sat on the back burner.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of discussion on why not. Maybe it's just you know hasn't there's always the workaround of comments, so
Okay.
that's all I
Um,
can figure.
I'm happy to move it to RFC2 because you are correct that this is in fact quite a minimal change when it comes to the actual like grammar. And do we set up rules for ourselves around when pull requests need to, I guess it's like the pull request needs to exist for it to be a draft,
Yeah,
which it
exactly.
does.
It is a little out of date, but I think it's probably fine. Given it was written by Ivan, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. Um, cool. I think the other criteria for RFC2 is it has an active champion. And so, Stephen, you're volunteering to take over as champion for this one.
Yes.
Sweet. All right. Um, I'm gonna tap that one up to 2. And I think you should hopefully be able to just like grab this existing PR since it's in the main repo and just like push to it. I don't know exactly how the PR rules work there. If for whatever reason that doesn't work, then let me know and we can have a new pull request take over this one.
And so then, yeah, next step for stage 3, the PR, getting it fully tested and merged or ready to merge. Um, and then yeah, consensus solution is complete. Spec edits,
Yeah,
which I think
this
are
is also like a nice, like often I would suggest grammar changes merging with a flag first, but this one seems fine to merge without the flag because it's not like changing the behavior of GraphQL in any way. It's just like adding a new property that previously didn't exist and now can exist.
And we also wouldn't use any other syntax to do it because this is the syntax we already use throughout GraphQL. So yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking of potential gotchas, and I guess if clients eagerly start using this and the servers they talk to don't support it yet, then
Right.
they're the
But
white parsing will
that's a
fail.
pretty easy
But
gotcha, which is like it comes back with the syntax error right away.
Yeah,
And you
yeah, it's
just,
pretty clear what went wrong, and you just change it.
yeah.
Yeah,
And that's going to be the case anytime we evolve syntax, even if
yeah,
it's just additive only. It's like you could
yeah,
always talk to a tool that doesn't support it yet.
yeah. But particularly, yeah, the operation syntax. But cool.
Um, all right, cool. You've got pretty obvious next steps too, which is just to rebase these two. I think we should get that we should prioritize getting the GraphQL JS one merged. Um, you should also put a line on the next working group agenda for this, just to like report some progress, because I can imagine it would be easy for us to just kind of like slip this one behind everybody, and I want to make sure everybody else who's like managing implementations sees that you're working on this and is like, oh yeah, I will implement that.
Yes. Let's see. June 5th is the next one. Yeah, I should be able to do that.
Nice. Makes me think we should have like an RFC tracker somewhere that's easy to find, like here are all of our open RFCs. Here's, sorted by stage. Here's their champions. Um, which we'll do that as part of spec cut, but it would make it easier for implementers to like follow along with what changes they need to prioritize adding in.
Hmm. Yeah,
But
the slick
anyhow,
UI. That'd
yeah,
be cool.
exactly. Sweet. Thanks for picking this one up. This will be cool.
It's the little things.
Always. Oh yeah, check that out. Benji's got a
Yeah, at first I thought that's what you were alluding to was Benji's RFC tracker.
yeah, this one is like scraping the GitHub issues, right, Benji?
Yeah, we need a better system in place before we have anything official. And that is one of the things I'd like to work on, but I'm spending my time elsewhere at the moment.
Yeah, fair enough. Um, cool. Okay. Benji, let's talk about error propagations.
Okay. Imagine, if you will, that there's some kind of change that we want to make to GraphQL syntax. Like we want to send something new to the server, but we don't know whether the server supports it or not. Imagine, for example, like adding a description to an executable operation. How do we know whether the server supports that or not? We don't. We can just send it, see if it sends back an error or not. Or we can talk to our colleague and say, hey, do you support this? Or we could have a capabilities system. So this comes out of the discussion 2 weeks ago on ways to disable error propagation. And specifically, we needed a way to indicate both that a server supports disabling error propagation and also potentially give that server or service the ability to indicate that error propagation is disabled by default. I'm personally of the opinion that we want to move in the future towards error propagation being disabled by default for all future newly created services, and errors to be handled on the client instead, because I think that solves, honestly, one of the biggest issues that people have with GraphQL. So, after discussion with you last, I don't know, whenever it was, a couple
Last
of
week,
weeks ago.
maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't keep track of time. I explored this a little bit, and I say that I explored it today for a few hours. So this is like hot off the press. Um, when I was thinking about it originally, I thought that this would be a bit like feature flags. So just a list of feature flags that the service supports. Some of them might be grammar related, like do you support descriptions on operations? Do you support fragment arguments? Anything else like that, where there are syntactical changes to GraphQL executable documents that need no representation in introspection because they don't add anything on the server side, only really on the client side. Um, But as I thought about it more, and especially as I thought about Lee's thoughts around the idea that this isn't actually a schema property, but is in fact a service property, does the service support these capabilities? Um, I realized that this is actually really useful for a large amount of other things. For example, a service might want to indicate that it supports subscriptions via WebSockets, or that it supports subscriptions via server-sent events. It might want to use it to indicate the change in the default error behavior, or any number of other capabilities. We might also want to use it to indicate support for certain RFCs, a specific version of incremental delivery, and so on and so forth. So this actually seems to be quite a useful thing where we would like people to be able to provide their own values. So I don't think that this is necessarily a list of built-in spec strings, but actually just strings where the spec
Mm.
reserves a namespace. As such, I started looking into using the reverse domain name format for doing things because it seems like the best way of avoiding collisions. And so that is what I have, and this is not consistent, what I have started writing up. So I've just put the link to the RFC in the chat. We'll skip over all the bits to do with error behavior for now. Come back to that later in the call. If you look in section 4, so anyone watching this back on YouTube, this is pull request on the spec 1163. So if you look in section 4 of the spec changes and then drop down to 128 introduces the service, the Dunder service type. I've also introduced on line 93 the entry point to that, which would be through Dunder service. And then the main bit is the service type section on 235 onwards. But more specifically, jump all the way down to 326, and I start providing some of the example ones that we might want to support. Now, initially, I thought that this is actually something that we might want to backfill into earlier versions of GraphQL as well. So we could backport this into GraphQL 15, for example, and it might not support, I can't remember what it doesn't support, but maybe it doesn't support the specified by directive, for example. So what I actually did is I went through GraphQL JS's get introspection query function and looked at all the parameters that it supports and essentially turned those into feature flags. Because ideally, we would like to send one request to the service to say, hey, what features do you support? And then use the result of that to then build the introspection query that then digs in deeper. So a lot of these, I think, will be used to indicate features that introspection has. Technically, these things can also be determined by doing introspection queries against introspection. But if you do that from a clean slate, you might need 3 or 4 chained introspection queries to figure out different things. For example, the subscription type field on Dunder Schema might not exist. So you now need to look at Dunder Schema's fields so that you can then determine whether or not you should ask for the subscription type. So by using the capabilities, we can turn that into just a simple 2-stage introspection for everyone. The first stage is ask what the capabilities of the schema are, and the second stage is then build your query and issue it to the service. Of course, as I mentioned before, it also indicates things like support for particular syntax and so on. So I'm keen to hear what you think about this approach.
I'm trying to think like what's the minimum viable thing that we need to solve the problems at our hand. Because I'm always a little nervous of like when you realize that there's adjacent value that you could get, and I was like, oh, oftentimes it's actually a sign that we've like pushed this too far. Because if we said this is not the problem we started with, but just because it's the value adjacent piece. What would we need in order to get exactly the right introspection query every time? Um, I think we actually have everything we need. We don't necessarily need a new mechanism for that because you can do introspection on the meta types. So you can first say like, I know that there exists the meta types, and I know that there exists like the base level, what fields exist. And you just do that over the meta types. And from that, you learn which ones are available. And then you deduce then which ones you can include and not include in your introspection query. And that would let you write a constantly up-to-date version of a tool that essentially does a two-pass. Like the first request gets introspects the introspection system, and then the second request like actually uses the introspection system to fetch your schema. Um, and I might make the case that despite it being a little kludgy, it's actually a better solve than flags because it's like extremely clear. It's like directly pinned to the type system itself. It says this field exists as opposed to a config flag, which then has this extra step of like this config flag exists, and therefore the spec says that if that flag exists, then this other thing must also exist. Um, which hopefully will always be the case and there won't be bugs, but there's something nice about the introspection system saying like, no, like actually the field called description exists on this type. So you can call it and you'll get something. So that's my first thought is like maybe there's a domain of the stuff that we'd want to put here that we don't necessarily need to put there, and therefore we can keep it very focused on of the set of things that introspection doesn't already solve for you, then what? And the error behavior is one that and you can't like introspect the introspection system and then arrive at an understanding of that behavior. That one definitely seems like we need a different solution. And I like capabilities. Um, I like the reverse domain thing as like a way to say, hey, these are just strings, and in order to not step on each other's toes, all the GraphQL ones will say org.graphql dot something. Um, that's nice, and then it we actually don't like need to say that much about how you should do yours. Like it should hopefully be then fairly obvious, um, because that's like a relatively common way to do that. Then I'm curious, like there's I think like three different paths we could take to or at least three that are clear to me about how we use these. One is that it's purely a flat list of strings, which is what you've proposed here, and probably is preferable, which essentially implies that these are all Boolean flags, like they either exist or they don't exist. Um, I can imagine for the extensibility case that might be underwhelming, um, especially if there's some kind of capability flag which has like a very large number of variants. Because we were thinking about, there's three different error behaviors. There's no propagate, propagate, and halt. And, then we could just expose those as three capabilities. And just like based on which capability string you see, like that's the one that you have. Um, But you can imagine if it's like an arbitrary string, like now the capabilities say like this capability prefix will come with this suffix and someone is like reverse engineering a key value pair. Maybe that's fine. Or do we want to model these actually as key value pairs? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I thought about this a bit actually because I started by trying to do it within with the values and or with the capability strings, and yeah, it doesn't work well. One of the main issues is if we pretend that we're only currently proposing two types of error behavior, but we might introduce halt in future, then essentially what you can say is if the default no propagate behavior, default no propagate capability exists, then assume no propagate, otherwise assume propagate. And then later you introduce halt and you're like, oh, they've set the default to halt, but I don't know that capability string, so I've been instructed to ignore it. And it doesn't have the no propagate one, so it must be propagate. And it's not, obviously, it's the complete other end of the scale.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think that works at all. Key value pairs is an interesting take, but it won't be long until that problem then expands to a string is no longer enough, and now we need to encode, JSON values into the string or something like that. It's going to get more complex again. So what I did in this actually is I just added another field to service for the default error behavior. So I think having a field that determines whether or not setting the error behavior is a capability. So whether or not on error is supported, and having a field that indicates what the default error behavior is as a separate field, as a property of the service, because actually you're right, the default error behavior isn't a schema feature, it's a service feature. And it could just be set by the service entirely. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Um, but in doing that, we are buying ourselves the like two pass introspection problem again, because now you need to know first, well, I guess in general, we need to know, can I ask, like, does the service field exist? But as this thing evolves over time, you'll need to like first ask, hey, does the service type have a default error behavior field? Okay, now that it does, now I'm going to query it. Um, which may be pedantic for this case because we're going to introduce it as the very first one, but you could imagine in the future there's some other thing that we want to expose as a well-typed key value pair thing here as a field. And now you need to know, like, does this service define this at all, or does this not exist? And that could be like quite an annoying bit of tooling to have to build.
Yeah, so I wanted to reflect on what you said before. You're right, like to add more to your argument that introspection already supports these things.
Hmm.
There are systems like I think GraphQL Ruby are quite big on adding things to introspection, and they give users ways to do that. So this is something that people do. They extend introspection and add extra metadata or whatever it is that they need to do. And to discover that stuff, you would need to introspect the introspection system. So yes, absolutely. That is a thing you can do and a thing that in some situations you should do. But on the other side, there is, Ivan did some research years back saying essentially we don't have two-stage introspection. We have three or more stage introspection. And as we expand GraphQL, it will become more so because you need to do one layer of introspection that uses only like the 2015 version of GraphQL to ask about what introspection types and fields exist. Then you may need to do introspection on those to see what their, arguments are or something like that. And then you can finally build that final query.
Yeah.
I couldn't come up off the top of my head with an example that needs that today, but I've seen Ivan's work on that, and there is that. So by using the capability system also for introspection, what it would introduce is essentially two-phase introspection, as in it will always be exactly two phases. The first phase, unless you implement an older version of GraphQL, of course. But from this point onwards, step one is find out what the capabilities are. Literally get the list of strings, and that is the only thing you do. Dunder service, capabilities, done. Tiny little query, get a list of strings back. Then you take that list of strings and you can build an introspection query from it. You fire that off and you're done. That's it. Job is finished. At the moment, What you actually need to build an introspection query is an algorithm that goes, performs introspection, then comes back again, looks at the results of it, figures out what things to add next, and then goes and does introspection again, which is, I would say, more complex. I imagine something. So if you look at get introspection query, there is no algorithm to do this in GraphQL.js currently, which I would say is an argument to say this is something that is complex to do. But GraphQL.js has the get introspection query function, which you pass a list of Booleans to. And these capability strings are essentially a list of Booleans.
Have
Yeah.
have have we discussed the a similar I wouldn't say it's completely would replace capabilities, but similar mechanism of a server specifying the edition of GraphQL that it supports. Like we have like releases that could be analogous to like in like Rust, for example, rolls up breaking changes by into editions. And so if you support the GraphQL 2025 edition in your server, then every feature in the spec up to that point you support. Um, Now, so this wouldn't be able to encompass, I guess, like like GraphQL Ruby's, all these different features that are not in the spec. But the advantage I see is that it simplifies the kind of support matrix of features instead of granular, feature selection and having to think about mix of different features that are enabled or disabled is just which linear progression of additions that you support or don't.
Yeah, this is something that we've discussed in the past. Like the need for indicating the capabilities of a GraphQL service is something that has come up quite a few times in the working group. And we have talked about the idea of feature flags. We've talked about the idea of indicating capabilities through a header, for example, and like standardizing a header that can be used if you're exposing GraphQL over HTTP. Um, the main the main drawback to it is it doesn't easily support experimentation with new features like fragment arguments. It needs us to do a spec cut in order for people to be able to start using features, and we haven't had a spec cut in like 42 months at this point. Even if we were to do them more frequently, even if we were to do them every 12 months, that's still potentially quite a long time without people using a feature. And we want to make it really easy for people to test these features whilst they're being proposed so that we can find the issues with them as early as possible. So I actually, when I was writing this up today, I actually did introduce and then remove a GraphQL org.graphql.sept 2025 as a value, and basically started writing up, if you have this in your feature flags, then it means all of these capabilities are present. But it didn't feel quite right. And also it meant you need to know what those features mean like forever, rather than you now need a
Yeah.
table to look up a feature compatibility table, like where you look this up and look for each thing rather than just saying for each feature you actually care about.
This is part of why I'm nervous about the allure of this feeling like a simpler way to do two-pass introspection. Because again, like we didn't set out to solve two-pass introspection. Um, and I buy the argument that it's probably slightly simpler, like that the algorithm to deduce from a list of capabilities how to build like because ultimately what you want to know is like a bunch of booleans of like should or should I not include this flag. Some input goes in and you eventually have this set of booleans of like which flags get turned on and then you or which fields get turned on in my introspection query, and that allows you to write your introspection query. And it's like you could literally just like take a list of config flags that map directly to booleans, or you can like do this thing where you crawl the data structure and use that to pull out the booleans. I'm not convinced that one of them is like wildly more complicated than the other. They're like in similar domain of complexity, but certainly like crawling an introspection result is a little bit less clean. Um, but it makes me nervous that it then means like every single property of the spec now needs to coincide with a capability, now like backpropped and into the future. And like we're gonna have a section of the spec that's just like capabilities is just like twice as long as the spec itself because it has to describe all the things that are there. So it's part of the reason why I want to kind of like apply a constraining pressure on this of we can leave room to explore those things in the future if we just deem them valuable. But what's the minimum viable version of this that unlocks the thing that we want, that feels like it has design space for us to continue to operate in as we want more ideas? And to your point, like unlocks the appropriate extension mechanism. Because I do think it's quite useful to say, hey, before there was no way to introspect a service. You could introspect a schema, but you couldn't introspect a service. And services tend to have a lot of pretty custom behavior that goes on. And having some way to know, like my service supports this thing or doesn't support that thing, or based on if you hit, that endpoint or this endpoint, what region it's in, or is it a dev build or a prod? I don't know. There's like people are going to do stuff with that. I think that's pretty cool. And then the thing is to figure out like roughly what kinds of things will we expect them to do, and will this actually be a useful extension mechanism, or have we overly constrained it? Which is part of the reason why, like Benji, you and I were talking about this before, of um, our desire to kind of keep this a flat list of strings is the simplest possible thing. And that might still be the answer, but it does make me a bit nervous that people may put like strings that they need to parse in there because we haven't given them a way to represent more information. Um, a key value pair where the value is a string also buys some amount of parsing, but you could certainly say like this is a numeric string or this is a JSON blob, or like it at least makes that thing open to interpretation.
Yeah, and
And we
you
can
can come
also
up.
have it be a nullable or, like an optional field. So if it's just like null, then it's just that implies it's a Boolean flag. It's a flag without a value. That also seems fine.
Yeah, or just the empty string. I think we probably, depending on how we modeled it. Yeah. So let's think more about what we actually want to indicate about a service, because this isn't really something that we've particularly talked about in the past, to my knowledge. For example, just thinking about it, like I said before, you want to say whether the service supports subscriptions over WebSockets or not, but that's not what you want to know, actually, is it? It's where is the WebSocket endpoint, which is the
Yeah.
string value.
Yeah.
You might want to say, does this service support, here's another good example, automatic persistent queries. But again, that may not be a Boolean. Do I support that? But actually, what is the default encoding mechanism? Like, is it SHA 256, for example? Or have we moved on to SHA 512? So most things, I would say, you're right, probably are string values. And if we do string values, then yeah, the default error behavior again would be default error behavior halt or propagate or no propagate as the value.
Hmm.
The ability to set the error behavior would be a Boolean, but we can have a convention of either setting it to the empty string or setting it to the string one or the string true or something. I would like to make sure that we establish a solid convention for that, because I don't want to get into the capital Y, lowercase y, capital T, lowercase t, one, all the Booleans.
Yeah. My low conviction suggestion there was to have it be a nullable field so that the absence of a value implies that it's a Boolean. That way we avoid any like string encoding versions of an existence flag. Like if it's an existence flag, that just means it's a key without a value. And if it is a key value pair, then you provide a value. And if that value should indicate something useful. Um, and it's probably the case, especially if we think that the default
You
error behavior, which is our first use case, like that will be a key value pair, it sounds like, because there are a handful of variants of what that behavior would be.
I was just going to say it's a one-off, but of course it's not a one-off because it's on output. But if we then represent it as a directive, it would be on input. Fun. Yeah, so you're essentially thinking that capabilities might be a list of capability or dunder capability objects which have a key and a value, where
Yeah,
key is
have
a non-nullable string and value is a nullable string.
yeah, I would probably call it name. But otherwise, yep, exactly.
Name, yeah, of course. Or
Yeah,
identifier.
I think that makes sense. Which you know, for the thing that we originally aired into, it makes the query slightly more annoying just to get the list of keys. But if we think that um, providing values is going to be a pretty common thing, then that'll be nice. Um, but yeah, this seems promising to me. I think the other thing where we'll have to be cautious, both what we put into spec and what our guidance is like a decent number of things that you might put into a service config actually belong in a different layer of abstraction, right? Because there's like your HTTP API service, which contains your GraphQL endpoint, which you might like send HTTP requests to get headers back that describe the behavior that you should interact with it with, which is like purely at the HTTP level and actually isn't doesn't have anything to do with GraphQL.
Hmm.
Um, like what compression do you use? It's like that has nothing to do with GraphQL. That's not like a service config. That is a HTTP config. Um, but there will be some things that are unaccounted for at the HTTP or whatever protocol level that are GraphQL relevant. And I think
Yeah,
that will be like a really useful mechanism for capturing those things.
yeah, it's good to include advice to say don't put stuff in here that's not GraphQL relevant. But also maybe to give examples that are. So I'm thinking that the automatic persistent queries is probably a good example.
Yeah. Yeah, especially I like doing the prefixing thing because it gives a lot of room for vendors to play with ideas. Automatic persistent query, like, hey, when you send your GraphQL request, if we haven't seen it before, we're going to cache it for you. And the response, in addition to your payload, will also include an HTTP header, which will have an ID in it that you can grab and send us that ID back. It's like all of that is going to be super custom to the vendor, but they can put a little flag in there that's like we support, you know, you're now on a service that supports that. Cool. Awesome. Interesting.
Yeah, that's great. It also allows just basic, yeah, any weird custom behavior that people want to do. And that weird custom behavior can become the standard behavior in 10 years' time if they come and then submit it. So
Hmm.
yeah, awesome. Okay, cool. That makes sense to me. I also reflected your hesitations about using this for introspection as well. I was thinking the same thing as I wrote it up. Like this is going to become a really long list of flags.
Yeah.
But I also was like, yeah, but also the introspection query is like 5 meg, and it's going to be a while before we have 5 meg of strings in this, so it's probably okay. And
It's
to
also
be
like
honest, 5 meg is small.
the you know, there's a very small number of implementations of that like introspection loop. It's basically like every core implementation has to have some mechanism for doing that. And it's part of the reason why I'm like less concerned about the complexity of that. Because like we should basically scale the challenge of implementation with the number of implementations there will be. It's like how many consumers of GraphQL are there? There's a lot. We should aim for that. How many people are like implementing the double introspection method? I don't know, a dozen? We should care comparatively less about that because we can probably find all those humans and talk to them individually.
Honestly, I think that's what most people do. Like they just figure out what the service supports experimentally and then store those booleans. And it's just a shame because it means that
Yep.
other things, it's too much effort, honestly, to write that algorithm. Like I'm not aware of anyone who's actually bothered to write it. Like you just find out what it is and you put the
Yeah.
booleans in. Um, would be
I
nice.
also I think especially if these end up being a list of capabilities with names and the name has the domain convention, then I don't think that you need to like you have in your proposed spec text like a firm definition of how to write out those domain strings.
Hmm.
And I suspect that those are not necessary because behavior of GraphQL won't depend on parsing them. We don't need to know that like if you use a dash or an underscore or a dot or like we're not actually like routing anyone to domains here, so we don't necessarily need to be parsing these things. We can treat them as opaque strings, and this ends up just being a convention to ensure non-overlap.
Yeah, I considered that. And then I thought about what some people might do and like putting emojis in it and doing all sorts of other uncomfortable
Opaque
things.
string,
And
like
it's
it'll
like,
work.
yeah.
You'll be fine. Like the real thing is like don't use org.graphql.star. Like org.graphql.star. Or we could literally just we could do double underscores for internal capabilities. That's probably annoying. I like the domain one better. Um, I think treating them like opaque strings is because the real thing that we care about is non-overlap.
Yeah.
And if someone decides that they're not going to do anything at all, and then someone clobbers them, it's like it's your own fault. We can give you good guidance in the spec, and then you have to follow it. But like if somebody adds in a capability that doesn't include a dot, like are they not spec compliant? Like how do we want to treat that?
Yeah, I kind of want to say that it must contain at least one dot, because otherwise I'm worried people are just going to use whatever the handiest, simplest string is, and they're going to shoot themselves in the foot. And I'd rather have, or other people, or it's going to become a standard. Like, yeah, if you support APQ, you just add the APQ capability. It's like, but whose version of APQ? Well, it's ours because we were there first, we're in the situation at the moment where there was the GraphQL WebSocket library,
Yeah.
which used the what was it? It was GraphQL Transport WS was the module name, and GraphQL WS was the protocol name. And now we've got the GraphQL WS protocol, sorry, module name, which can't use that as the protocol name and has to use a different one. And it's just like if they were namespace to like, com.apollo.ws, it would have been fine. But if you don't like force people to do that, I think a lot of people are just going to put WS and it's going to stick. But whatever. Maybe we'll just
I'm
put it
just
in there
looking
as
at
strong
since
advice.
the inspiration for this is originally from Java, I believe.
Yeah.
I think Java was the first one to do this. Here's a nice short thing. I think we can probably like steal a little bit of their copy and then punch it up a bit to be closer to our style. Um, like they don't go as far as writing out a grammar for it. They just describe it. I think this is, dot separated ASCII is a pretty easy one to just like describe. Um, I also realized that they have a convention where the Java language itself starts with Java dot and not org dot Java dot. Um,
Hmm.
and so that might also be interesting to say um, our first class ones will always be GraphQL dot capability. And the naming convention that we have is GraphQL dot capability is the internal one that we reserve, and then all others should be reverse domain notation. And then we can just provide a couple of examples. Um, and then I think it's actually a good, maybe it's too paternalistic, but I think it's a good idea in the implementations to check for the existence of a dot in the capability name. And if it's not there, then throw an error. Because you're right that like some people will just never read this. They'll go to add their thing and they'll shoot themselves in the foot. And so the existence of a single dot is probably good enough to catch all of the cases where someone is doing it incorrectly.
Yeah.
And we'll probably also want to have, in the same way that we have like introspection types or dunder types, have like a special way to get introduced into the schema. And if you start your type with double underscores, then GraphQL.js will throw an error. We could do the same thing. We could say like if it starts with GraphQL dot and it's not part of the ones that GraphQL.js defines, then throw an error. So those two cases together seem probably like the right balance to make sure that you haven't collided and you've done the bare minimum to make sure that you're following the naming convention. But if someone wants to write like if Apollo wants to write AP dot name, fine. Like they chose not to use the domain notation. Um, I don't know how hard we have to go on like validating reverse domains.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay, that will make sense. So, final thought on this is, and this is thinking ahead rather
Yeah.
than things to actually do right now. Um, if we wanted to represent this in SDL, um, so okay, there are some SDL is commonly used as an input to things like code generators, right? And code
Yeah.
generators may well, or other tooling may well need to know whether, for example, fragment arguments are supported or not, whether the error behavior has this particular value or not, and so on.
Hmm.
So including this in SDL makes some sense. We could do it at the moment with either a schema directive or we could introduce document directives, but then we're like 3 levels deep of adding features to to enable us to do this.
Yeah.
If we were to support it temporarily via a directive, are we essentially saying that this would be like, for example, at service brackets capabilities colon list of input objects where each input object has a name and a value? Because that feels like it's fairly verbose. But I think also what we're saying here is there's not going to be many values in it. And like maybe it would discourage there being too many values in it. So it's kind of okay.
Um, yeah, I think we can probably double stage out, like have the first RFC introduce this concept and have the second RFC introduce how to use this concept through the SDL, because that'll give us some room to make progress and then also like open up the discussion about the SDL. But I can kind of see it in my mind's eye of how it would work, which is when you print, when you output an SDL, the default mode should be you are outputting the schema,
Yeah.
but you can optionally in that code say, I want to also output service config, in which
Mhm.
case, whatever syntax we define for that, like the very first thing is the service config, followed by the, schema block that's like tells you the type names, and then boop, everything else. And similarly, when ingesting an SDL, um, if a service config exists or service capabilities block exists, then great. You can just grab those and um, have them represented and then if your tool that spools up a service with the schema has that, it can use it. Um, in terms of what that syntax might look like, I think it depends on what we imagine the full shape of a service object being. Um, I can imagine that this list of capabilities is the primary, if not only, thing that we would want. And if that's the case, we might even be able to drop the capabilities wrapper there, and otherwise, yeah, what you wrote there is like roughly what I would expect. Right here, I'll write a quick gist. Um,
with quote marks maybe around the keys.
yeah, I guess that's an open. Yeah, I think if they're ultimately arbitrary strings, they should have quote marks because
That's why I'm trying to think ahead to what we might do, because I think that might then, I mean, you often say, right, start with the most restrictive thing. And the most restrictive thing is be very precise about what this can be and then open it up to arbitrary strings later. Um, I think that's generally a good starting point.
all right, here I'll send you this. Typing it somewhere where it can exist after the Zoom call closes.
Very wise. Yeah, I normally copy things into the notes, but I'm not taking them because it's only the two of us.
Um, that might be overly simple, but the idea there being that
Yeah,
a
that you easily
service
ignored.
is listed as a list of its capabilities, and that's it. Um,
Hmm.
where each capability is the name of the capability, and then if a value exists, then colon the value. Um, but if a value does not exist, then it's just omitted. And then, as per other places, commas optional.
Yeah. I after I wrote the one before, I did kind of the same thing and trimmed off the colon null because you don't really need it. Um, I from the preserve option value, like I don't know what else we're going to want to put on service in future, so maybe it makes sense to preserve that. But also, we don't need this to be service. Like that keyword on line one there that you have could literally be the word capabilities
True.
or features or something.
Yeah, I was trying to think out like what are the other things that we would want to put on this over time, and the only other thing I can think about would be directives. So a service has a list of capabilities, and then I don't know why yet that we would put directives on services if we already have capabilities, maybe as a mechanism for you to define more fine-grained something or other on that service. Um, but otherwise, like basically the way to think about this is like a simplified YAML block kind of thing. Like it's a data config.
Yeah. And I'm wondering whether config actually deserves to be there, like service config or something like that, or just config. But config is a bit generic. Hmm.
Um, this is kind of why like I think capabilities is a technically more accurate word word than config because it is describing what it can and can't do or how it does it. And the fact that it was configured to do that versus it was the default behavior is like more of an implementation detail. Um,
Mm.
and so anyway, we don't have to go super deep in the weeds on the SDL syntax, but that's a potential path for us.
Okay, cool. That sounds good. So I'll see if I can find some time to write up this as the version for error propagation, and then we would only need it would have two capabilities. One is whether or not you can set the error behavior yourself, and the other one is what the default error behavior is.
Yeah.
And that should be enough to get us out the door and start using this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, Unofficially, I'll also indicate how you could indicate it for now through a directive so that tools like GraphQL Code Generator can start leveraging it. Um, yeah, sounds good. Okay, there is another thing that maybe we should think about here for a moment, which is um, one of the when you add stuff, when you add new syntax, you break existing clients, and sometimes you do that deliberately because this thing
Hmm.
changes things. So I am changing the default error propagation behavior of GraphQL is an interesting challenge, right? Because it's like we've had this version of GraphQL for 10 years, and now we're saying the new one is going to do different. And ideally, existing clients that spoke to a new server should fail. Like because what they would get is unexpected. And if you set your new server up to say, I don't want to support legacy clients, like that should be a thing and we should be able to detect that. Originally, my plan for that was that's fine. All non-legacy clients need to indicate an on-error behavior. Otherwise, it's just going to be assumed to be propagate. Um, but having to include that with every request just seemed a bit of a chore and a bit ugly. Um, anyway, I don't have any concrete things on that, so I'm going to move on. But
Okay.
it's a thing that's itching at me slightly.
Yeah.
All right. Do you remember what things were looking quite close that we could look at? I'm going to load the list of RFCs. Oh, yes, the replace execute selection set with execute collect fields. Do you remember where we landed on that? Was there some action required by me?
Um, Good question. Let me pull that up.
It's 1039.
Um,
I
I
think it was
think
just
we were
go.
just doing like naming tweaks and editorial review on this. I have no qualms with the change itself. This has become very clear in the last couple of months that this is the right move.
Okay,
I
awesome.
see Martin had some other suggestions on accuracy improvements that he added.
Yeah, um, yeah, I looked at
That makes
those.
sense.
I actually considered doing that at the time.
Hmm.
There was a reason I didn't. It was like maybe it was to do with the use of the word selection set wasn't used that much before then or something like that. I don't remember. Um, but I mean, selection of fields is technically correct.
Cool.
A valid sub-selection set is perhaps more complex way of wording it.
Yeah.
Rob was looking for a review on the renaming of execution. Oh, that was the other thing. You proposed on that PR, the one that you were looking at just then, the idea of renaming grouped field set entirely. Um, I forget, what was it you proposed as an alternative? Like collected fields or something like that.
Was I the one who made that suggestion?
Yeah, collected field map, maybe, if memory serves. I think it was you.
It is yeah, I think like a general thing that I'm always trying to do is like have a fairly constrained and well-defined set of nouns and verbs, where anytime we have an algorithm, it's like verb noun, you know. I
Hmm.
want a verb noun and like noun is well known. And um looking at execute collected fields implies that there's a kind of thing called either a collected field, and this operates on a list of those things, but that's not quite right. So anyway, yeah, there's something that seemed slightly off about the noun part here.
Yeah. So this was originally obviously execute grouped field set. Um, but
It's also not a set. I think that was the other. Yeah.
well, yeah, that I think is partly the issue, but it is a set. It just we declare it to be a list, but it is a set.
Right.
It's a map of sets.
It's a map of sets. Yeah.
Yes. So the grouped is the map and the set is the set. So
Right.
I think grouped field set is still accurate, right? It's a field set that then has been grouped by its response key. So it's a map of field sets. So I raised a separate pull request, which was just the idea of actually naming that and defining what a field set itself was. Um, but yeah, there's still some discussion to be had around these names.
I'm also, I mean, obviously we should do these kind of one step at a time instead of trying to do it all in one giant change. So, and I appreciate that renaming one of the key building blocks here is a non-trivial thing. Um,
So I think the main thing was I had an issue with execute what was it the with a collected field map because to me it was really important that the fields themselves are plural, like it is a field set. Because you're always passing around the list of these fields for that are the same for the
right.
response key. Um, so that was one of the main bits of feedback that I gave was like, let's add an S and then I'm okay with it. But honestly, I think grouped field map is group field set is still actually correct.
Yeah, it's not wrong. It's just there's room to make that named thing clear. It's like it's grouped, but the thing that causes it to be grouped we call collect.
Mm,
So, like, why do we have two different words to describe this? You know, the result of collecting is a group. Okay. And then we call it a set, and it's like it isn't a set, it's a map, but the grouped part implies the map, and the things in the group are sets. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's just like it's hard to deduce what the thing is by reading the name of it. But
yeah,
ultimately, like we don't have to solve in this PR. It's
I see where you're coming from. I
yeah,
think
the intent of my comment there was not to say like let's change this in this PR. It was me riffing on having read through this and going, this is quite strange that the type name of the thing going into this method really um, does not align with the name of the method itself.
so. Do you think we should change the name of it back to execute group field set rather than execute collected fields? Because I quite like that the execute collected fields ties in with the collect fields algorithm rather than necessarily the data format. Because collect fields is recursive, right? That's why it's collect as opposed to group, which is the end data structure is not recursive. It's a flat. map of sets. So that's why those two things don't like align.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I think the making the name clear here is part of the work. Um, all right. I might just have to go like read through it line by line and see if we can pull off getting both names. The only thing that was making me nervous about collected fields is that it ends in a plural, which implies that it operates on a list of collected field, um, which may be just like me being too pedantic in how I read it.
I see what you mean.
Because I agree with you that like there are more than one field in there, and so pluralizing that does make sense. And that was the thought on like tacking map at the end. If it's like collected fields map, now makes it clear that it's one thing which contains many. I don't know. This is um maybe it's too fiddly. And I appreciate that the thing is getting shorter. But I don't know, like we call it a selection set, not a selections set.
Yeah, the set itself implies the plural though, right?
Yeah.
So a field set rather than a fields set. Yeah, and if you said execute selection sets, you would expect there to be more than one selection set,
Hmm.
which is a list of selections. Yeah, or set of. Mm. Yes, interesting. All right, well, I'll let you put your editorial hat on and work your way through that. Um, I did, as I mentioned, I put in the chat a link to another pull request that basically uses a field set and defines what a field set is. And
Hmm.
honestly, from implementing GraphAst, referring to these things as field set rather than fields makes life so much more straightforward because you don't get confused as to what they are. I
Yep.
often thought that fields, or my instinct when I see fields, is to think of it as the fields that are selected on the result that I'm completing rather than the fields that are being completed. Like
Yep.
I'm expecting them to be a layer deeper. Um, because they're fields, right? And I'm only executing one field. So why would I have fields with it? But if it's a field set, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is the set of that field. Again, that should arguably be field selection, or yeah, it's not, no, because you don't want it to be selection set, but it's yeah, it's a set of field selection rather than a set of field as in the GraphQL field, which is another thing that we call field, the actual one on the object type. Yeah, naming, fun.
Um, we also yeah, okay. I was gonna say maybe selection is an interesting name to chase here. Could be like collected selection set, but I don't think that's quite right either, is it?
No, it associates too much with a selection set, which can have other selection sets in it nested.
Right. A selection is either a field or one of these other things that are valid things to select.
Yeah.
Um, where yeah, a field is a more specific kind of selection. And this is actually like unfolding all of those other kinds of things and resolving them all down to fields.
But field is not unique either because a field that is a selection can have an alias and stuff, whereas a field that is the property of an object type
Right.
doesn't obviously have an alias. So it's, and obviously we refer to both of them in the same algorithms as well, right? Because you need to look up what the field is to find its resolver, for example, which is
Yeah.
different from the field that you're actually getting from the selection. It is
I
a
don't know,
little
this isn't
bit,
that crazy of an idea though. I'm trying to remember whether Nick or Dan should be credited with this idea, but there was, I think Dan. There's a long ago when fragments were very first getting introduced, um, Dan was like the biggest opponent to fragments getting introduced. He thought it was adding too much additional complexity. Um, and he wanted, as an alternative, to treat it as purely a client-side transform step. So a client-side GraphQL could define this concept if they wanted, and what actually would happen is there'd be this sort of like client-side cogen step, and it would spit out just a list of fields, which was what the version 0 of GraphQL was, just a list of fields only. Um, and and ultimately it was the like upload bytes argument that won the day, which is like you could do that until you realize the combinatorics of like this results in a 10x bigger uh, upload payload, or even the inability to do caching, like to evaluate the same thing multiple times. That won the day. But the idea was that like the base truth, the thing that you're ultimately trying to get towards, is a flattened list of the fields that you're going to execute over,
Yeah,
because that's ultimately the thing that your like executor really cares about.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, which was actually the very original definition of a selection set. Your selection set was the set of fields that you've selected, and field is the omitted word. Like the long version is the set of selected fields.
Yeah,
Selection set as the shortened version of set of selected fields. Um, and so it's not that crazy to say like
and
that.
associated alias and arguments.
Yeah. Alias is being part of that, right? Like a selection implies the response for that as well.
Hmm.
Um, okay. Yeah, let me noodle on this more.
Okay, changing the topic to nullability. Um, I am keen to get what we were just discussing like out so that people can start
Hmm.
building the new services with error propagation turned off. That said, I still want to be able to support people like Facebook, Meta, who want to be able to use it with existing systems. And I want to do that in as non-breaking a way as possible. So I do see these as split up. I do see that we should be able to ship the request parameter before we ship a way
Yep.
to migrate. But I also reflected on the transitional nature of what I was now proposing, and I've written up. I can't remember if I've told you, but I've written up a alternative take on this, which is essentially I've done it as an appendix, entirely as an appendix to the spec. So implementation of it is completely optional. It doesn't like need to integrate deeply with
Mm,
the rest of it.
might
Um,
work.
I
Oh
was
no, Benji, I'm
interested.
getting a phone call. I may need
Oh,
to run.
yeah, sure.
Um, but let's keep jamming on this. Shoot me a message with this thought. This is really interesting.
Okay,
All right, sorry to cut you short. All right, see you
no
soon.
worries. Catch you later. Bye.